Welcome to this Climate Finance Training Kit. This is a presentation on barrier analysis and theory of change, which is representing important parts of what usually goes into project proposals. So presenting the barriers that prevents us from implementing the activities or performing the investments, and theory of change, so the logic behind what activities we want to implement and why they are needed to achieve certain outputs and outcomes in our project activities. So we'll take you through how to structure a barrier analysis, how to transform the barriers into action, and also how to structure your theory of change and define activities and structure them in a log frame. So a barrier can be defined as any condition that substantially reduces the probability of mitigation or adaptation measure to be adopted. And they're therefore also the sort of defining element of why a sector or country or subsector is locked into a certain high carbon development or a non-climate resilient development pathway. And therefore, overcoming these barriers that we identify is at the heart of achieving the scope of our projects and programs, and achieving also a paradigm shift or transformational change in the sector or technology or country where we are addressing with a project and program. And we'll come back to the topics of paradigm shift and transformational change in a later presentation. So to identify the barriers or the most critical barriers, we need to perform a barrier analysis. And the primary goal of the barrier analysis is basically to understand the nature of the barriers and their interrelation as well. And also to determine which barriers are central to the lock-in in the situation that we are at the moment. So we also need to identify maybe which barriers are likely to remain in place as risks after we have implemented our activities, since not all barriers are sort of under control of the project developer or program developer. And we also need to describe how we want to address these identified barriers. And even though there is no exact way on how to perform a barrier analysis, and the process may vary depending on the envisioned activities, the stakeholders, the local context, and so forth. But there's usually a set of steps that we go through when performing a barrier analysis. So we need to, of course, organize the process. How are we going to perform this barrier analysis? What sort of sources of information we need to use? Does it require stakeholder interviews, literature research, and so forth? Then we need to identify and classify the barriers. We need to analyze and decompose them and prioritize them to find the critical ones for our intervention. And we need to translate the barriers into actions. And by doing this, we can develop a plan to create enabling environments and make implementation of our projects or make the investments happen. So the first step involves a consideration of how to organize the process, as mentioned. Here, usually the starting point is a preliminary desk study that can be complemented with national literature or information identified in the country by researching policy papers, other documents. In many cases, we look at the NDC, technology needs assessments, national communications, and so forth. But we also might need to interact with local stakeholders directly as well at this stage. Further on, we can also here we provide a sort of visualization that can help you understand better what to consider as barriers, how to identify the root causes, and also define the impacts of those barriers. And ideally, usually in the process that we have described earlier, the relevant stakeholders would be consulted through maybe, I don't know, working groups or through various ways to elicit inputs from them. Um, and we could present them with something similar to this, which we call a problem tree. And the first thing that we do is to identify the core problem. In this example, exemplified by deforestation, but it could also be other core problems that we try to address. It could be, farmers are vulnerable to prolonged droughts, waste is not well managed and disposed and burned, or something similar. The next step, we move towards the roots, so downwards in this tree, and define the causes of this problem and why this is happening. For example, it can be due to lack of regulation, there is not a developed market, there's a lack of support structures, lack of infrastructure, or other root causes. And the further down we move, the more we identify the root causes and barriers that we need to address and then need to be overcome, basically. And identifying the root causes makes it possible to specify the barrier, clarify the reason of their existence, and also makes it easier to identify possible ways to overcome these barriers. And this tree then can also be used to sort of scout for non-critical barriers, and usually that is done by looking at the sort of root system. And when we look at the barrier and the category does not have components at lower level, usually the identified barrier by not be a crucial barrier for implementation. Not always, but that can be a good indication. And then when we move upwards towards the branches of the tree, here we describe the impacts of the problem. So for example, if the problem is the lack of development of renewable energies, regardless of price or competitiveness, I mean, the impacts could be high energy costs, energy dependence on imports, etc. And I mean, then if you look at high energy costs or dependence on imports, this can further have other impacts like negative impact on the trade balance, negative impacts on the economy, productivity, competitiveness, and so forth. And basically having this visualization, it can help in clarifying to the stakeholders the different types of barriers that will arise for a different set of actions or projects along the whole process chain. And the result of this first exercise, when we're done with this, is that we're able to identify preliminary list of barriers identified under the causes, and is useful for this sort of brainstorming of the factors that have kept the country in a status quo in terms of high carbon development or non-resilient development. So after we have first identified the barriers and critical barriers through the problem tree, it can be useful to sort of classify the barriers to clearly describe them. And in this classification, we're chosen here to provide these 4 types of classes, so political, economic, capacities, and social, which can then be subdivided again into subcategories. So in political, it can comprise elements within the political spheres, looking at regulatory framework, legislation and policies, or to even more practical aspects such as cross-governmental coordination or even day-to-day work like issuing permits and timeline for this or something similar. And when we look at economic barriers, we could subdivide them into, so again, economic, financial, or even market conditions. And this category sort of has a broad range, so it can extend from the firm level, or looking at technology costs, for instance, or even at the sort of higher level, looking at power structure and sectoral lobbies, or or even the financial sector. So the cost of finance, and all the way down to political economy, like the current incentives that are in place that maintain the status quo, for instance. When we look at capacities, it's usually composed of technical capacities, which include the absence of or lack of experience within a technology, for instance, and corresponding human capacities within the labor force and within even the public sector and their regulators. Two, also, I don't know, it could be incomplete and non-accessible data, which is needed to feed relevant models to make projections on technology applications and so forth. When we look at social barriers, this category basically develops along the lines of cultural and educational awareness and behavior, which basically can create the preconditions that do not allow end user to obtain certain stands or to start implementing certain practices and so forth. And barriers that can be identified in all these domains might or might not have impact on the financial aspects of our projects and programs. So also when structuring the financial aspects of our proposals, there can be barriers identified outside of this economic domain, which might have an influence on the financing aspects. So it's important to sort of classify them, but also consider all of them, and which are important to consider to be removed in terms of facilitating investments in the measures or technologies that we are addressing. This is just an example of a classification and decomposition of barriers for a project on energy efficiency, where you see we have regulatory barriers, financial barriers, and in this case, demand-side barriers. I will not dwell in length into reading all these barriers, but basically listing how the regulation has an impact, the lack of minimum energy performance standards, the energy tariffs, the current fiscal incentives, and so forth that are a barrier towards increasing investments in energy efficiency. And then dedicated financial barriers, looking at the financial institutions and their capacity in terms of energy efficiency and the risk perception for investment in energy efficiency because of the lack of these capacities, so increasing cost of finance, and then some barriers on the demand side, so the lack of demand for high energy efficiency facilities due to low energy tariffs can be a barrier for increased investments in energy efficiency. So identifying these barriers might then be used to identify which actions do we then need to take to overcome these barriers and increase investments in energy efficiency. Now that we have the barriers, we can also prioritize them. So the initial list of barriers that we have, it should be analyzed and filtered according to their significance. And basically this enables us as project developers to keep barriers that are crucial and disregard those that are lower importance. And this is usually a process that happens also through the identification, but it's important to have a clear understanding of which barriers are the most critical ones and that needs to be addressed, and which don't we have control over, and which are maybe not so relevant to address. Then we need to translate the barriers into actions. So when these critical barriers and the causal factors have been identified through this decomposition of barriers, we can basically translate the barriers into actions by making the negative statements, so the barrier statement, into positive statements. And this basically translates the barriers or causes into measures to overcome the identified barriers. And this is sort of the first step to identify which kind of enabling environments needs to be created and what kinds of activities need to be implemented. So a positive statement can be translated into measure, can be, I mean, in this example, I mean, poor forest protection is translated into good forest protection is enforced. But here we need to also envision how this will happen. And in essence, we need to look at the causes that we have identified and translate them as well into positive statements. And the measures can usually roughly be divided into financial and technical measures, which often require one or several forms of source of financing. And financial measures usually entail actions that are directly associated with the availability of financing to the implementer or the end users, like subsidies, power purchase agreements, or loan guarantees, and so forth. While when we talk about technical measures, we usually have a wider range. It can be legal, regulatory interventions, demonstration projects, capacity building, education and awareness campaigns, and so forth. So even though donors tend to differentiate between financial and technical components, everything that is evidently non-financial is considered technical. There's not necessarily a direct correspondence between financial and technical measures and market and non-market barriers. So, for example, a barrier for a technology, for instance, the reluctance of households to install solar PV, might be overcome by a mix of financial and technical actions. So an identified barrier can also be overcome by a multitude of identified measures. And depending on the identified sort of decomposition of barriers, there might be a need, in the solar PV example, there might be a need for a solar PV feed-in tariff, metering, legislation requiring the utility company to buy electricity and bear the cost of connection, for instance. And basically, when actions to create enabling environments for the project have been identified, the proposed actions need to be assessed in order to define their feasibility. So when we assess them, we can use a range of criteria before deciding on which specific actions we need to make. We usually talk about looking at the action's costs and cost effectiveness, their potential social and environmental impacts, the interdependence between different actions, the institutional feasibility, and their complexity. These are all aspects that can be considered when deciding on which specific actions we want to make. And the barrier identification process can also help us identify which financial instruments would be appropriate to use in our projects and programs, and what sort of action to take, which then can help us identify which sort of source of climate finance we should address. So basically, the identification of the financing instruments should be based on the specific barriers for implementation that we had identified for the specific measures that we try to introduce. Here, if we imagine that we want to introduce a renewable energy technology, but initial capital investment required basically hinders us from implementing the given technology, one approach could be to reach an agreement for temporary tax breaks for the import of the technology, for instance. If the problem is the high interest rates provided by local banks, we could look for financial partners who have green credit lines with favorable conditions. If the barrier is a lack of experience of skilled staff in the technology, we could look for grants for technical support and demonstration projects. And basically, every instrument proposed should be based on an argument for why it is needed. And one instrument alone, in many cases, will not be enough. So we see a multitude of like grants for capacity building, loans for investments, together with guarantees or other sort of mixture of instruments that are used in climate projects and programs. And often there is also a need to mix different regulatory instruments together with financial instruments to reach favorable financing condition. And it is basically this aggregation of instruments that leads to the creation of financing mechanism that get basically the goal, the end goal is to get it just right to make the wanted measure implementable with the lowest amount of concessional finance needed. And here we can exemplify it by an intervention by the public sector through tax holidays and guarantees, which could facilitate attracting concessional finance. And I mean, in any case, government commitments illustrated through direct action is also a very successful tool of leveraging finance and reduce the risk perception of investors. So having investments from the public sector usually helps in sort of attracting other sources of finance. This just goes to show how different instruments can be grouped together and how different financial instruments can address different types of barriers. So now that we have identified barriers and identified the actions that we need to make, how do we structure this in our project proposals and description of the activities we want to do? And usually this is done through a theory of change and structure in the theory of change and log frame. And it uses a specific set of terms. So I'll introduce these terms first. We talk about inputs, which is basically the financial, human, and resources used for the development of the intervention. We'll talk about activities, which are the actions taken or work performed through which the inputs are mobilized to produce the outputs. The outputs are the products, capital goods or services, which result from the development of the intervention. And then we have outcomes. This is the sort of likely or the achieved short-term and medium-term effects of the interventions, so the activities and outputs. And then in the end, we have impacts. So the sort of longer term positive or negative can be primary or secondary effects of our intervention. And these can also include both the intended and unintended impacts. Of course, unintended impacts are hard to know ex ante, but we can make some sort of thoughts about what the probable impacts of our actions and outputs and outcomes will be. So looking more at the practical approaches, it looks sort of messy, but I will take you through it. Similar to how you structured a barrier analysis through a problem tree, we look at structuring a thought process in boxes, where we have activities with outputs, outcomes. In this case, there is an intermediate stage that leads to the impacts. But this goes to show that there are different ways to set this up. I'll show next the example of another way of setting it up, where we have the outputs leading to specific outcomes, intermediate states, and impacts with the description of drivers and assumptions behind our outcomes and states or impacts. Or there are also other ways of structuring it in sort of more table. We'll not go into the specific details of these specific theories of change, but it's just to show that it's basically a structured thought process of why we're doing what we're doing and what the expected outcomes and impacts of our activities. And this is usually how donors and climate finance providers and funds request to have presented our proposals. So when we have done that, it's easier to structure then the theory of change into a log frame that basically uses the same sort of thought process, but it's just, let's say, simpler. When we look at inputs, results, and outputs and so forth, but we also usually apply indicators and modes of verification. So this usually forms the sort of backbone of our project log frame, which can be presented here. So it's basically translating the theory of change into a table where we have activities in the bottom with inputs. We also define indicators. We define means of verification. So we also use this for project and program reporting and provide assumptions for what is needed for the specific results to take place and so forth. So the activities in the bottom row lead to the outputs, that leads to the outcomes, that leads to the impacts. And again, an example of how the theory of change can be translated into different types of log frames. So translated into the activities and so forth. Another example is just for illustration that there are multiple ways of doing it, but they all follow the same logic, even though they're presented in a different way. And basically, this goes to show that well-performed barrier analysis provide the foundation for a well-defined theory of change, which then is a good foundation to describe the mitigation or impact scenario of our intervention, where we basically look at what is the baseline, where are we coming from, is it the high carbon or non-resilient development path. Through our work plan or log frame, we describe the activities that we want to implement to achieve the outputs and outcomes and impacts we want to achieve. That shows basically the difference at the end between the baseline and the intended impacts, both in terms of course, greenhouse gases, but also the financial impact and in many cases, sustainable development impacts. So having a well-defined baseline provides well-defined outputs, provides well-defined work plan, which provides well-defined impacts and demonstrates to the climate finance providers that what we present is basically the best value for money, the most impacts for the investments that they can get. So to sum up, this is a process to present impacts and outcomes and identify activities. We start with the problem and objective tree when we interact with key stakeholders to identify causes and effects. We convert the problems into objectives and therefore also identify actions. We established the theory of change based on those actions, and the problem and objective trees helps us identify sort of the causal relationship between activities, from activities all the way up to impacts. We need to identify the drivers, so the contributing conditions inside the projects towards achieving our results, the assumptions that we made. So there can also be other conditions outside of the projects that are needed to achieve those impacts, but which we do not have control over, and also to identify other results, the ones that we don't have necessarily also complete control over, like the impacts and intermediate states. And we need to formulate the log frame. So the formulate the activities to overcome the barriers and define the needed inputs. We will need to formulate the result statements for the outputs and outcomes. We need to identify indicators to track the implementation and usually also set some milestones. So this brings us to the end of this presentation on the barrier analysis to identify the actions needed to achieve our intended outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Thank you very much for listening in, and thank you for contributing to a brighter future.